This morning, our guest is Lisa Qualls. She and her co-authors have written a book entitled The Connected Parent, Real Life Strategies for Building Trust and Attachment. But meantime, it's important, Lisa, to let people know that you are the mother of 12, and many of those children have been adopted. Lisa, good morning and welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
This book, I think, is probably one of the most important books that parents and people who are raising children or dealing with children that come from what you write about in the book as hard places is so critically important. Before we start talking about the contents of the book, tell me about your relationship with the late Dr. Karen Purvis and how you guys came into community.
Well, we started our adoption journey way back in 2006. And at that time, we read the books, we did the training, we thought we were well prepared. We had been parents for 20 years when we brought our children home from Ethiopia. And despite all of that training, we were very quickly in over our heads. You know, our children's needs were significant. They were suffering from the impact of a lot of trauma in their lives and neglect and adversity. And we were plunged into this very challenging situation where we needed help. We had to find help. But at first, we didn't want anybody to know that we were struggling so much. We had been speaking about adoption and telling the church and our people, this is what God's calling us to. And we didn't want to discourage anybody from answering that call, but we were struggling. And I had started writing a blog, One Thankful Mom, in 2006 before we ever brought our kids home. And it was one of my readers who told me about Dr. Purvis and Dr. David Cross's first book, The Connected Child. And I read that book and I learned so much that I didn't already know. And then I also got to see some videos of Dr. Purvis teaching. Mm-hmm. If you ever had the opportunity to see her teach live or even on video, she had an incredible gift. And I felt that she exuded so much hope for children like mine. Mm-hmm. And I really grabbed onto her hope because we did not have much, at that point. Well, over time, as I learned more, I began writing a lot about what I was learning from Dr. Purvis, from her book, from videos. And then I went to a conference, the Christian Alliance for Orphans Conference, and I had the opportunity to meet her. And she and Michael and Amy Monroe had founded Empowered to Connect. And through a number of things, I started writing for them. Eventually, I was able to speak with them at their conferences.
Wow.
And that's how I got to know Dr. Purvis. And I had this idea for this book. And would you like me to go ahead and share about that?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Well, my thought was I have a lot of books by professionals and they were wonderful. And I'm so deeply thankful for every book. But I found that when I was in the very depths of my struggles, I would read their books and I think sometimes, but I don't think they understand what my life is really like. Mm-hmm. They're asking me to do things that I don't know if I can do. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to have a book co-authored by one of these incredible professionals, Dr. Purvis,
right,
and by a mom actually living this life, doing it every day, doing the best I could. And so I presented my idea to Dr. Purvis and she thought it was a great idea. And that's how the book was born.
Wow. Never did you think that she would lose her battle?
No.
Before the fruition of the book would manifest, I'm sure.
Right. And we started writing the book in 2012. It took a very long time because she was diagnosed with cancer. Mm-hmm. And so there was a long pause. And during that time, I learned a lot about how to write a book proposal and I was working on it. And then when she was well enough again, we started writing and we were in the thick of some really hard parenting. And so we had to take some breaks on our end. And then in 2014, we were going strong on the book. And after Christmas that year, we were in a terrible car accident and we lost one of our daughters.
Wow,
Calcidon.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. It was really very, very difficult, as you can imagine. And I was very injured in the accident. And I remember thinking at that point, we'd been working on the book a long time, and I thought, I don't know that we'll ever be able to finish it. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to really write again, if I'd be able to think again. And after a little time passed, it just struck me that I actually needed to finish the book for Calcedon. I mean, she is the reason that I learned so much of this. She had such significant needs, and she was so beautiful. And so I went back to Dr. Purvis. I said, let's do it. Let's get it done. We started writing again, and then her cancer returned. But she was working on the book right up until nearly the very end of her life, and we got it to a really good place. And I'm just so thankful. She never got to see it. She didn't get to sign the publishing contract, but, we owe it all to her. I mean, all of this book is because of her.
Wow. There have been so many challenges just getting the book into the hands of people like our listeners and viewers, and people like myself who have 2 children that are from those hard places. Now, you write about your family's experience with adopting children, and our best efforts and our best hearts couldn't prepare us for the trauma that in many cases those kids are unable to articulate. Let's talk about how we begin to dissect that so that we can do the job that we believe that God is calling us to do in being a village and raising these children.
Well, I think it's really important to surround ourselves with community because we can learn so much from one another. And in some ways, that's a little bit what this book is, by sharing my own stories and struggles. I hope people feel that I'm walking with them in their own journey. But what I see happen a lot is that we are well-meaning. Many of us love the Lord. We love children. I mean, I loved being a mom. I had chosen to devote my life to that. And when my children came home, and particularly with Calcedon, when her behaviors were so extreme, it just filled me with fear. Like, what have we done? And how can we ever turn this around? What is it going to take? And
so in that moment, and you talk about her behavior just being something you can't even, you don't even begin to know how to rechannel it. In that moment, you can't, there's no turning back because you believe that this is the call on your life and for their life to be with you and to parent them. How do you figure out how to fix it? And fix it is not a good word.
yeah.
How do you figure out how to deal with where you are?
We were very fortunate to get the right kind of help. But the first thing that we had to do was recognize that what we were seeing in front of us, this behavior we were seeing, was what we had to learn to see behind that. What was it that was driving this behavior? We began to understand that the abuse and trauma that our children and other children have experienced actually rewires their brain so that their brains do not develop the way children who are raised in a secure and safe environment do. Their brains are wired differently. But we also learned that there was hope, that this brains can also heal and they can be rewired in more positive ways too. But it's going to take a lot from us because our children are hyper alert. They are hyper vigilant. They are running on a very sensitive fear response. And so we had to learn that when our daughter was like raging out of control, that was actually coming from a place of fear and an inability to calm herself, to stay in her thinking brain. She would very quickly move from up here in her thinking brain down into her lower brain where it was all about fight, flight, and freeze. And she was a fighter. And so what we were seeing on the outside was all this very out of control behavior, but it was really rooted in deep fear because of all the things that she had missed in her early years.
And talk about those early years, because you get her at what age?
5.5.
Okay. So you're thinking at that age, the sapling is still bendable. You can still mold it, but there's a lot of challenges. And then when you, not only challenges at home, but challenges at school.
Yes. Yes.
And how do you explain that, those sensory processing disorders, to the school?
Well, and how much of our children's stories do we share? Right?
Right.
Like, and my children, so I have 4 children from Ethiopia. My oldest came home at 10. Calcadon came home at 5.5, and our boys came home at 2 and 5 months. And, I think people a lot of times think, well, they were little, especially with my boys, they were little. But when we think about the foundation that is laid in a baby's early days, weeks, months, years, the baby, as Dr. Purvis explains so beautifully, the baby expresses a need and the parent meets that need. The baby cries and the parent picks the baby up. The baby cries because they're hungry and the baby's fed. And over, this child expresses the need and the need is met. And the whole lesson of the first year of life is I can trust. And so when a child's needs are not met, when they express needs and they are not met, or they're maybe met, but not in a kind and loving way, the child begins to experience what we would call toxic stress. And that changes the way they see the whole world. And so for us, I think really grabbing hold of that and then beginning to learn new ways of calming these fears. A lot of what I think I learned from Dr. Purvis is that I've got to build trust. And I'm still doing it. My children came home in 2007, but those wounds are deep, and I feel like I'm still constantly aware of building trust with my kids.
Wow, that's powerful. And so when they start to become school aged, because we are also the parents of 2 small children, and you're right. You think when they're small, certainly if you fill their hearts with love and safety and security, that it'll be okay. But then there's another level or another layer, and that is the structure of school. How do we then help them to integrate into this environment that is unfamiliar but necessary and be successful?
Well, it's interesting because some children have such a deep need for structure to feel safe that they actually thrive in the school environment and struggle at home, because home and family is what is so terrifying to them. I remember our daughter's therapist, I was homeschooling and it was just so difficult. And she said, Lisa, the hardest thing Calcadon does every day is be in a family. And
Wow.
If you can let her go to school where she feels safe, where it feels familiar, all the children are doing the same thing at the same time. I think in a lot of ways it was reminiscent of the orphanage. And so it felt familiar. And then the hard work of having a mom wasn't blended together with also mom being teacher, mom, being with me all day long. And that was such a surprise to me, because my instinct was that to really build attachment, that I needed to keep my children close all the time. But that was actually too hard for one of my children, for Calcadon. Now with my other kids, I have found with one in particular, he needs to feel connection more than anything else. He's very, very relational. And when he was in 5th grade, he started out the school year. We had just transferred him to a different school, and that just threw him off because he was all about relationships. And he started out the year struggling. And I met with his teacher and I told her, if you can capture his heart, he will be yours. And I don't know what she did, but she turned it around. And what we know about our children is to feel safe, we meet those needs in three ways. We empower them. We talk about empowering, connecting, and then correcting. And empowering is more about the physical body, meeting all the physical needs. And then the connection, of course, is about relationship. And it's about that heart connection where we put all of our interactions, we put the relationship at the center of the interactions, and then correction comes last. And I think what this teacher intuitively figured out once I shared that with her was that she needed to build connection before anything else. And it was kind of brilliant the way she did it. So I think some of our kids are going to need extra supports in school. They're going to need 504 plans. They're going to need IEPs to accommodate for some of their needs. One of my kids is a strong sensory seeker, and his teacher had him sitting on a exercise ball instead of a chair. There were fidgets on the table for him to work with his hands. So I think we need to educate our kids' educators and share with them what we can and what we know, while still not overexposing the details of our kids' stories.
Okay, so with that said, let's explain to people, because I didn't know until I read this book, The Connected Parent. I was not familiar with sensory processing disorder. And what I found when I came to understand it was, this is what our children are dealing with. Explain that for people who are like me, just didn't know.
Well, I am not the scientist, but I am a mom who's lived with a lot of sensory processing.
You have a lot of empirical data.
Yeah, I do. That is true. But for some children, the way their brains are impacted by this early trauma and neglect, the way their brains process input, sensory input, can be very different from kids who didn't experience this trauma. Although I will say, a lot of really healthy, typical kids can have significant sensory needs. We all know those kids who can't wear socks and where the tags have to be cut out of their shirts and things like that. But with my kids, and with a lot of kids with early adversity, their sensory whole system will not be developed normally. So they may be children who crave sensory input. They're the kids who, one of my boys did a lot of banging on the wall, and it wasn't aggressive. It was like the rhythm and the feel and the sound. They might be kids who don't really have a sense of where their body is in space. And so they might like crash into you or bump into things or knock things over because they just don't have a good sensory sense of where their body is or how it's moving. They might be kids who are actually aversive to sensory input. So like I have one child who even now, after years and years, will put on like ear protection in the house because it's just too much. All the auditory input is just overwhelming to him. They can be ultra sensitive to smells. They might actually crave really intense flavors like spicy things or really sour things. There are all kinds of things. And what I found for me personally that I talk about in the book is one of my children was very aversive to touch and eye contact. Now, we use touch and eye contact for connection, for building trust and attachment. And so I interpreted that as an attachment problem. And it wasn't until a professional said to me, have you had him evaluated by an occupational therapist? That's who evaluates for sensory processing. And when I learned that he had sensory processing disorder and all kinds of different sensory challenges, it gave me a whole different sort of paradigm of looking at his behaviors, that it wasn't personal, that he couldn't sustain eye contact. It was actually very, very difficult. And touch didn't feel good to him, and especially soft touch. Like he could handle like a tight kind of side bear hug kind of thing, but he couldn't handle like a hand on his shoulder. That just was very, very distressing to him. So you begin to be a little bit like a detective with your kids. You have to really think, okay, what is it that seems to be setting things off?
And those in some cases are triggers for those kids, is it not?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I was having this conversation with our child's teacher, And one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation and we felt like it was so important is because now, more than at any time in our lifetimes, we're seeing more kids who are being adopted into families, more kids in foster care than I know I've ever seen in my lifetime. And these kids, when they come into families or they're adopted, it's not because they were on a winning streak. It's because they come from a hard place.
Yes.
So our sons are in school, and the oldest, when he can't have his way or he has a meltdown, he is going into what the teacher calls is a screaming fit. Now, he was doing this initially when we got him, and we were able to redirect that behavior. And so she and I were saying, we really think he knows what he's doing. Is this manipulation? And then I read this book, and I snap some of the pages and I send to her, because it appears to be defiance. So help us to better understand it.
Well, I think especially when we come from a traditional parenting model, especially a faith-based traditional parenting model, it is very easy to assume that this is defiance, that this is purposeful. But the more we understand the brain,
Right.
the more we understand that these children, they just don't have the window of tolerance. Other kids, something might make them unhappy, but they're not going to start screaming and scratching at you. They might be upset, but they're able to sort of regulate themselves. But our kids can't do that. So they get this, whatever it is that triggers it, they so quickly go into this fight, flight, freeze. And so a child raging on the ground, that's, that could be a fight response. And so then we have to think about, what I try to think about is, first of all, how do I preempt that? Is this happening during transitions? Is this happening when there's loud noise? What?
Or is this happening, in our case, it's happening when the child cannot have his way. It's about control.
Okay. So for whatever reason, that is triggering some kind of fear. And that fear is still driving this behavior. So I try a lot of different things. And, our children are not like little computers. So it's not like when we do it exactly this way, it's all going to turn out right. But sometimes if we know what it is, if or his teacher knows that the things that he wants to get his way on, that he can't get his way on, are going to be coming at a certain point, then I would run ahead of that and say, okay, I know he's going to have a lot of trouble because he's going to want this. So I'm going to figure out what are calming things for him that I can do before. Or I'm going to go to him and say, in 5 minutes, you don't have to say it to the whole class necessarily, but in 5 minutes, we're going to be doing this. And you get his little brain preparing for whatever's coming. A lot of kids are very calmed, believe it or not, by chewing bubble gum, because it puts a lot of pressure in these big jaw joints, which is very regulating and calming. And so maybe a transition that is coming that's going to be difficult, a piece of gum might actually be helpful. I mean, there's so many small things that we can do to try to preempt these meltdowns. Once they happen, then it's really important for us to stay really calm and just try to bring that child back into calm and regulation. Sending them away and going into sort of punishment mode will only usually bring it up higher.
And so ostracizing the child or setting them apart makes it worse.
Absolutely. And a lot of our children have this deep core of shame, because even though they may not know it in a way that they can express it, it's all stored in their brains. It's all there. And so, and too, with children, I think especially, they're aware that they're not with their first parents, for whatever reason. They may not understand why. Maybe all they know is that mommy couldn't take care of them, whatever it is. But children take that in, like, was I not worth taking care of, And so when we are punitive, or we sort of move the child away, separate them, they just feel even more shame. And I think that puts up walls toward connection, you know? And so we have to be really careful. I had a high school teacher email me at the beginning of the school year, and he made a comment about one of my kids not being able to settle down. He said, so I made him go out in the hallway and run up and down the hallway a couple times, but he didn't really like it. And I thought, he shamed him, not only in front of his own class, but in front of every classroom that he had to run back and forth in front of.
Oh, wow.
He felt shame. And he's a great teacher. And I think he was trying to think outside the box.
Right.
But our kids will go to shame in a heartbeat. So we have to be really careful how we address these challenges.
So I felt your heart in this book, and had seen Dr. Purvis, and she is masterful. And I, like you and many adopted parents, feel like we are over our heads because you don't know what to do, because it does come across as defiance. So how, I know that you started the sensory process, and we are too, occupational therapy along with therapy. But how do we begin to heal their little hearts when we don't even know, not just the trauma that they experience outside the womb, but the trauma that was maybe experienced in the womb? How do we start to help them to heal so that they can be productive children first, before citizens, but productive children? Because I venture to ask the question now, are we having to ask teachers to do too much?
Right. And this is such a hard season for that.
Yes.
But let me back up to the first part of your question about how do we begin to heal their hearts? And, you know, Dr. Purvis talked a lot about balancing nurture and structure, that we have to have a balance of both. Usually we are inclined toward one or the other naturally, and we have to work a little harder to bring one up. I'm definitely stronger in nurture, so I have to work harder to bring up that structure, you know. But I think the most healing things I've done are the things that have created connection. I spent a lot of time rocking my kids in a rocking chair. I think a rocking chair is probably the absolute best tool for nurture and attachment that I know of. And what's interesting about rocking is it brings them close. And if they're little, their little head is hearing our heartbeat, their little ears. And we know Dr. Bruce Perry teaches that activities that are rhythmic, repetitive, and relational equal regulation. So rocking in a rocking chair while holding your child, even if they're kind of a bigger child, is very calming, it's very regulating, and it's very connecting. So for me, that was a very powerful tool for connecting with my children, bringing healing to their hearts. Also, just being willing to say to them when they're starting to get a little dysregulated and out of control, being willing to say to them, tell me what you need. Now, they may not be able to form words. If they're already too dysregulated, their ability to give you words is going to be greatly diminished. And there are lots of things you can do from there. But sometimes if you catch a child early and you can just take their little hands and look in their eyes and say, tell me what you need. Sometimes they're able to tell us. If they're not, we can offer them choices. You know, do you need a cup of milk? Do you need to, you know, sit on mommy's lap? You know, whatever it is, you know, we try to show them, you can trust me. I'm going to meet your need. I'm keeping you safe. I'm strong enough for this, you know? So I think it's a lifetime. I mean, I think children who've experienced significant trauma and did not have secure attachment, it is a lifetime journey of healing for them. It's not going to happen in a year or 3 years or 5 years. You know, one of my daughters from Ethiopia is 21 now.
Wow.
And she's still working through it, you know, and she's doing beautifully, but it's still work for her and for us. We're still actually having to show her she can trust us.
And I think that's what we thought. We thought, because I too did the rocking, you know, because when we first got the children, they were having horrible night terrors.
Yes.
I mean, horrible. And you know, you think, okay, we've gotten past this stage. They'll be okay. but now the 4-year-old, if it's dark, he has a fear of darkness that is not just the fear that children have of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
He will still come to my bedside at 2 and 3 in the morning and say, T, I'm scared.
Yeah.
And I have to reassure him that he's safe and he's
Mm-hmm.
okay. But when we integrate these children into a place where most of the kids are seemingly not having those challenges, they stand out. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you, and like you said, you can tell some of their story, but a lot of the story you may not even know to
True.
tell.
That's very true. We will probably never know our children's well, we won't. You won't. You know, what is written in the documentation may be a fraction of what actually our kids experienced, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry, what was the question there? I can't quite
No, it
remember.
was just a thought. It was more of a thought of not really knowing, because I think that I'm in that place where you are early on, trying to figure it out, trying to assimilate them into normalcy when they're really not normal. Their circumstances are not normal, but we want them to be normal.
And maybe that's too much to expect. You know, maybe they can't do it like other kids can do it. Maybe they're a child who's going to need in school some special supports. Maybe they need to be in a smaller environment for certain times of the day. Maybe they need to, you know, Dr. Purvis used to say with kids with sensory processing disorder, put them at the very front of the line or at the very back, because if you get these kids in the middle of the line and they get bumped and jostled, they're going to lose it, you know?
Right.
And so we may have to be thinking about really practical things for our kids and just know that they really are doing the best they can. They're trying, but it's so much harder for them than it is for other kids.
How do you help, Lisa, others to have the compassion? Because I can feel your compassion now, but I can also feel it in the book. To have compassion for those kids that seem to be disruptive. And one of the things I told our children's teacher and the principal is, I don't want, my husband and I and our family don't want these kids to be labeled as bad kids. And you can almost see that happening in
Yep.
pre-K, because they're presenting, there's another side. You can see that loving side of them, but you could also see that side where the people that are teaching these kids and dealing with these kids every day will say, these kids are bad kids. And there's no such thing as a bad kid, but how many times have we said it or been tempted to label children as bad kids? And I told them, more than anything, we don't want that to happen.
Right. Right.
So how do
Well,
we build compassion for children like these?
one thing we have in our favor is I think more people are talking about early childhood trauma than before.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are aware of the ACE or ACEs study, where it's a short questionnaire, and depending on the number, the more factors you say yes to,
Mm-hmm.
the higher your score. And higher ACEs scores can be almost predictive of health problems, mental health problems. Well, maybe predictive is too strong of a word. I'm not enough of an expert to say that, but it's not surprising when we see behavioral challenges with a child who has a high ACE score. And so I was advocating for one of my children in school, and I wanted this child to have an IEP, an individualized educational plan, which would give him accommodations so that he could have a little more support in school, all kinds of different aspects of that.
Right.
And when I was advocating for him, they were like, well, we don't see a learning disability. And I said,
that
well,
is the problem, because many of them are smart and they
yeah,
don't need what would seem like that extra help.
right.
And that's the misnomer, isn't it?
Well, it is. And so I basically said, my child needs this because of trauma and because of early life experiences. And as we went through this, and I finally said, and his ACE score is, and I told them, I said, I think that should give you an idea of the degree of challenge that he's facing. And they knew enough about ACEs. They'd had training in at the school, and that seemed to change things. They were like, oh, okay. Like when I say trauma, I'm not talking about small things. I'm talking about many difficult things, which is probably true for your kids too.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What's the most important thing that you want parents that have taken kids in from hard places, teachers who will teach those children, and people who will come into contact with children? What's the most important thing, and even adults, that you want people to know about being a connected parent? Because parenting isn't just the kids you're parenting, because if they're in a part of your tribe, you know, we all have a stake in supporting them.
Right. Well, one thing Dr. Purvis used to always talk about is that every child is precious, truly precious, and, you know, created in the image of God. And we as parents are very precious to the Lord too. And I think sometimes we get so discouraged and we wonder if we even heard God right. But I think what we have to remember is that we are all doing the best we can. Our kids are doing their best. We're doing our best. And it's going to be a long road of healing, and we just have to stick with it. I think if we think it's going to happen fast, we're very inclined to give up. But we just need to persevere for the long haul. This is about courage and endurance.
Absolutely. And I think that going forward too, Lisa, we want to stay connected, because what I told our kids' teacher is that we all need more tools in our toolbox, because we don't know just how to face many of their challenges, because they're not able, in many cases, not able to articulate their challenges. A lot of it is about control, needing to control the situation. And so we're all going to have more tools to try to help to be more effective.
Yes. Well, and in terms of educators, the Karen Purvis Institute for Child Development has a whole online course for trauma-informed classrooms. And so that, I think, is a great tool for educators. I know we are asking so much of them already right now, but these tools will help with all kids. I mean, that's one thing that my husband and I found when we really learned about connected parenting and what Dr. Purvis called trust-based relational intervention. We looked at each other and said, we wish we'd parented all of our kids this way.
Wow. Lisa, your spirit is amazing. The book is even better than that. Thank you for sharing your heart and your family and all that you are learning on this journey with all of us. The book is entitled The Connected Parent, Real Life Strategies for Building Trust and Attachment. Tell people how they can connect with other resources that you guys have available.
Well, they can find me on my website, which is onethankfulmom.com. And on my website, I have links for the book. I have 2,000 blog posts from when I started blogging in 2006. I often speak and do women's retreats, and they can find me on Facebook and Instagram at One Thankful Mom.
Lisa, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Indeed. Hey, everybody, stay on point. We're back after this.